I was born on this land, baptized in its mud and fed by its water. So when a nosy woman from the city tried to sell my lake and called the cops on me for trespassing, I gave her a lesson in boundaries she'd never forget. If stories of frontier justice and unexpected payback make you grin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. This one's personal. I've always said the lake knew me before I knew myself. I learned to float in its muddy shallows before I ever learned to tie my boots, and I knew every bend of its banks the way most kids know cartoons or baseball cards. It wasn't much by city standards. No paved path or wooden dock, just a horseshoe of water cradled by cottonwoods and cattails. But it was mine. Or at least, it was ours, in the way things handed down through sweat and sacrifice tend to be. My daddy carved this place out of hard dirt with little more than calloused hands and a stubborn heart, and when he passed, his ashes went into that water without ceremony, just the way he would have wanted. There's something about being raised by the land that never leaves you, even when the world tries to crowd it out. I've had city folk tell me I ought to sell the place, cut it into parcels and cash in. Retire somewhere nice, they say, like anywhere could be nicer than the place that taught me to shoot, to fish, to pray. I just smile and pour another cup of coffee, because it's not worth explaining to people who think land is just an investment. This isn't an asset to me. It's a story. And every cypress root and gravel path has a chapter. The trouble didn't start big. That's how it usually is. It starts with a stranger waving too friendly, or a car driving too slow past your fence line. First came the development signs down by Miller Creek. Shiny billboards with smiling families and words like Lakeview Haven and modern country living. I remember laughing. Lakeview, I thought. Which lake would that be? Surely not mine. No one ever asked, but I figured it was just marketing fluff. Then came the paved road, running like a scar through the hills, and with it came folks with manicured dogs and wine club stickers on their SUVs. I didn't mind them at first. Some waved. Some kept to themselves. I figured they'd last a winter or two, maybe a summer of biting flies and busted well pumps, then head back to the suburbs. But a few dug in. They formed an HOA, gave themselves a name and a charter, and rules about fence heights and mailboxes and where a man could store his firewood. I wasn't part of it. My land was a good mile outside their plotted neighborhood, and I had the deeds to prove it. Still, I started getting letters. Neighbor, they began, though the tone didn't match the word. We noticed some concerns regarding property aesthetics. One even said I ought to consider painting my barn a uniform color. I taped that one to the outhouse wall. Made good reading anyway. Then came her. I don't remember what day she first showed up, only that it was hot enough to fry eggs on the hood of my truck. She had one of those wide-brimmed hats and big sunglasses, like she was hunting paparazzi out in the brush. She carried a clipboard, which told me all I needed. Clipboard people never bring good news. She introduced herself with a sharp smile and said she was on the HOA Beautification Committee. I told her I wasn't in the HOA. She said, not officially, but all surrounding properties affect community value. I just looked at her, watching her squint toward the lake like she already had plans for it. She asked if I had a permit for the dock. I told her that dock's been there since my daddy sunk it in the mud with railroad ties. She didn't laugh. She wrote something down. Asked if I was aware that my livestock were visible from the main road and that my fence exceeded height limits. I said again, slowly, that I wasn't under their jurisdiction. She gave me this little half smile and said, things are changing fast around here. I watched her walk back to her car. Silver SUV. Clean enough to eat off. She stopped once and looked over her shoulder, eyes fixed on the lake. Not me, not the house. Just the water, gleaming in the sun like a promise. That's when I felt it deep in my gut, the kind of knowing that comes without evidence. That woman had plans for something that didn't belong to her, and I had a feeling she wasn't the type to ask permission. So I sat there on the porch that evening, the sky bleeding orange behind the trees, and I listened, to the frogs starting up their choir, to the wind brushing through the reeds, to the hush of something old that still remembered me. That lake had held me when I was a boy, and when I buried my father. I'd be damned if I let it be sold off as a feature, and I had a feeling this wasn't the last I'd seen of the woman with the clipboard, not by a long shot. It was early the next week when I saw her again. Same silver SUV, same oversized sunglasses, like she was headed to a photo shoot instead of a cattle gate. This time she didn't knock. Just stood by the fence with her clipboard, flipping papers like she was building a case against me in the dust beneath my boots. I walked out slow, not in any hurry. She tapped her pen against the wire like she owned it. When I reached her, she gave me a smile that didn't belong in the country. Too polished, too tight at the edges. "Good morning," she said, flipping to a fresh page. "We need to talk about the violations." I didn't answer right away, just leaned on the fence post and waited. The cows were bunched up behind me in the shade of the barn, and the sun was already burning hot across the gravel. She smelled like lilac and chlorine, not a scent you usually find on a ranch. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "Violations of what?" She lifted her chin, as if bracing for stupidity. "You've been cited for unapproved fencing modifications, livestock visibility, structural aging, and unsanctioned shoreline development." Then she paused, tapped her clipboard once more and said, "And potentially endangering community aesthetic standards." I looked at her. She didn't blink. "Lady," I said, "you're pointing that list at a man whose barn is older than your subdivision." She huffed. "We understand. Change can be uncomfortable, but we're working hard to create a unified vision for Lakeview Haven." I looked past her, toward the distant row of beige rooftops, stacked like plastic bricks on land that used to grow corn. "Funny," I said. "I don't remember signing up for Lakeview Haven." She glanced down at her papers. "Your parcel falls within the newly drafted HOA influence perimeter. It's non-binding for now, but participation is strongly encouraged. We're establishing a standard." I spat into the dirt and wiped my boot against the fence. "The only standard I care about is whether my stock are fed and my well pump keeps running. So unless you've got a badge or a warrant, I'd suggest you stop talking to me like I work for you." Her smile vanished, replaced by that clipped civility folks use when they think they're still in control. "We'll be submitting these violations to the county. You'll be given 30 days to comply or face escalating fines." I looked at her again. Not the sunglasses or the papers, but her eyes. There was something hungry in them. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She wanted something. I could feel it in my chest, the way you feel thunder before you hear it. "You want this place," I said quietly. She blinked behind the lenses. "Excuse me? You've got plans. Maybe not just you. Maybe your little committee. You see that lake as an amenity. You want it paved, trimmed, maybe with a few paddle boats and benches." She didn't confirm it. Didn't need to. Her silence was heavy enough to tell me I'd hit something solid. "I'll be back next week to check for progress," she said. I nodded slowly. "I'll leave the gate open for you." She left without another word, just turned and walked back to that spotless SUV. I watched her drive off, gravel crunching beneath tires that had never seen mud on purpose. That night I sat by the lake again. The frogs were loud, and the stars were coming out clear. I skipped a stone across the surface, counting the ripples. She'd come out here with papers and posture, but I had something older. This land had memory. You could feel it in the roots and the bones and the way the air changed after rain. It didn't belong to plans. It belonged to people, to blood and calluses and stories whispered across fence rails at dusk. She thought I was just some old bumpkin holding onto a patch of dirt. But the thing about land is, it holds on to you too, and I wasn't going anywhere. A week passed without a knock, but her shadow stretched longer than her absence. I'd started to notice things. Orange survey flags fluttered near my west fence, little plastic markers where none had been before. A contractor's pickup rumbled down my road one morning and paused a little too long at the edge of my property before turning around. The air had changed. It felt watched. I drove into town that Friday, not because I needed anything, but because I needed answers. I stopped by the county clerk's office, the one with faded maps on the walls and a sleepy ceiling fan that had probably been spinning since the Eisenhower administration. Carla was working the desk. She knew my daddy, knew the lake, knew I didn't come in unless something was wrong. "I need to see any new filings on my parcel," I said. She raised a brow, slid on her readers, and started typing slow. After a moment she clicked her tongue. "You sure about the parcel number? 'Cause there's a bunch of new activity listed under the Lakeview overlay." I leaned over the counter. "Overlay?" She turned the screen so I could see. There it was. My lake. My dock. My land. all outlined in soft green as part of something called a Preliminary Master Community Plan. The HOA had submitted it last month, and the lines crawled right over my boundaries like ivy. "It's not approved yet," she said, "but they're petitioning for annexation into the township. Says here they're calling it a Community Enhancement District. Real pretty words for a land grab." My jaw clenched, but I kept my voice level. "Can they do that?" "Not without a hearing. Not if you show up with the right paperwork." She gave me a look that said she'd seen this before. "You want me to print you copies?" I nodded. Every page. I spent the rest of the day in my truck, parked beneath the old cottonwood behind the general store, reading the documents line by line. Their language was slippery. Terms like shared water resource and environmental stewardship corridor snuck across the pages, trying to make theft sound like planning. They listed projected improvements too. A boat ramp, a clubhouse, guest parking. And there, in black and white, was a note about potential resistance from adjacent landowner. That would be me. They'd anticipated a fight before I even knew we were at war. I called up Hank, my friend from school who now worked property law over in Canyon Ridge. He was slow to speak, methodical as always. "They can't just take your land," he said. "But if they get that district approved and redraw the lines, they can argue for shared access to the lake. Or worse, limit your ability to fence it off." I told him about the flags. He sighed. "Get a surveyor. Independent. Document everything. And don't move a damn thing until you've got your hands around it." I hung up with more questions than I started with, but one thing was clear. She hadn't just overstepped. She was laying claim. Not officially, not directly, but in the kind of way folks like her do. Paper first, pressure second, then eventually, a ribbon cutting. That evening I walked the line from my barn to the lake, measuring tape in one hand, old map in the other. My boots found every soft spot where fence met dirt, and I marked each post with red paint, just to be sure. I took pictures, not for proof yet, but for memory, in case something got moved in the night. At the shoreline I sat on the edge of the dock, where the boards still creaked just like they had when I was 12. The wind stirred the cattails, and the last light painted gold across the water. I looked across that quiet surface and knew this wasn't about code violations or community standards. This was about ownership, about people thinking they could rewrite history if they had enough paper to stack on a desk. Well, I had paper too, deeds, surveys, and I had something stronger than ink. I had roots. It happened on a Tuesday, just before noon, the sky hanging heavy with stormlight and the air thick like it was holding its breath. I'd spent the morning restringing barbed wire on the south line, checking for gaps where the younger bull kept testing his freedom. The wind had picked up, tossing leaves across the yard, and I was just wiping my hands clean with an old rag when I heard the crunch of tires in gravel. 2 patrol cars, white with blue trim, county badges on the sides. Not locals I recognized. They parked crooked along the edge of my drive, doors already swinging open before the engines stopped humming. Karen's silver SUV was parked farther down, tucked back like it didn't want to be seen but couldn't resist the show. The first officer was tall, clean-shaven, with that tight-laced look like he ironed his socks. The second was younger, nervous behind mirrored sunglasses. They walked toward me like they were approaching a crime scene. "Sir," the tall one said, resting a hand on his belt, "we're responding to a trespassing complaint." I laughed before I could stop myself. "Trespassing? On my own land?" "Ma'am, down the road states you were seen crossing into HOA-controlled shoreline. Said you've ignored multiple warnings and entered restricted property." "You mean the lake?" I asked. "The one I've fished since I was 5? The one with my daddy's name carved into the old dock bench?" The younger one looked uncomfortable. The tall one didn't blink. "We don't make the rules, sir. We enforce the reports." I reached into my back pocket slowly, pulling out a folded copy of my deed. I held it out. "You want rules? Here's one. This is mine." He didn't take it, just gave me a flat stare and said, "We're going to need you to step back from the fence, sir." I looked past them to the SUV. Karen stood just outside her driver's side door, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding whatever expression she thought passed for righteous. "You boys are being played," I said. "She's got no claim here. That lake isn't hers. It ain't the HOA's. It's been Jenkins' land since long before someone dreamed up Lakeview Haven." "We're not going to argue out here," the tall one said. "Please turn around." I didn't move, not out of defiance, not out of pride, just out of disbelief. I watched the younger one shift, his hand twitching toward his cuffs like he was hoping he wouldn't have to use them. "You really gonna cuff a man on his own land?" I asked quietly. "Turn around," the tall one repeated. "Now." The metal clicked cold against my wrists. They didn't yank, didn't shove, but the feel of those cuffs locked around bone and skin burned worse than any shove could have. I didn't resist. Just stared at the trees, the lake, the barn, each thing holding still as if in shock. They walked me across my gravel drive like I was some thief, caught sneaking apples. Karen stayed rooted near her car, smiling just a little. I caught it, just for a second. That private, tight-lipped curve that said she thought she'd won something. They sat me on the tailgate of their cruiser, asked some questions, ran my name, radioed dispatch. The younger one took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, while the tall one circled the truck like a man searching for a problem he couldn't find. After 20 minutes, the radio crackled. I couldn't hear the whole message, but I heard the shift in their posture. They knew. Somewhere down the line, someone in that office pulled up my records and saw that I wasn't just some squatter with a story. My deed was real. My lines were clean. They took the cuffs off without apology, said I could go back to whatever I was doing. I didn't answer them. Just rubbed my wrists, nodded once, and walked back to the fence line, where the wire still needed mending and the sky had started to crack with thunder in the distance. The officers left with no tickets, no citations, no more words. Karen climbed back into her SUV, but not before glancing at me one last time. I met her eyes and held them, long enough that her smile finally slipped. I didn't wave. I didn't shout. But inside, something had shifted. She brought the law to my doorstep to try and bend me. All she did was prove that the fight had already begun, and I don't lose what's mine. It rained that night. Not a soft country drizzle, but a hard, sideways kind of storm that slammed the tin roof and turned the pasture into a shallow sea of slick mud and drowned grass. I didn't sleep much. Just listened to the thunder roll in waves, pacing like a restless thing overhead, the kind of storm that feels like a warning. By morning, the air was cool and clear, and I had a plan forming like steam off the wet fence posts. I wasn't angry in the way some men get, loud and red-faced and looking to throw punches. Mine was quieter. I'd learned long ago that the meanest bear in the woods didn't growl. It waited. I pulled the thick binder down from the shelf in my office. My father started it when he bought the land, back when paper meant power, and a man had to keep his proof in ink, not just memory. Every survey, every boundary map, every water right and well permit lived inside those pages. I flipped through until I found what I needed: 2 yellowed documents, both notarized, both signed by a judge who died 20 years ago. They spelled out, in plain language, that the lake and its banks belonged entirely within my boundary lines. I called Hank again. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything, slow and steady, making sure each word carried weight. "They tried to annex my shoreline," I said. He whistled. "That's not just bold, that's crooked. I want it stopped, and if I can't stop it, I want to make it cost them more than they can afford." Hank said he'd dig into the filings, but then he said something else. "You ever think about flipping it on her?" "Flipping it?" "Look into her. Everyone's got something. Karen types especially. They stretch themselves thin. New house, second mortgage, HOA fees. That kind of lifestyle looks rich but leaks fast. I hadn't thought about that. I'd been so focused on protecting what was mine, I hadn't even considered going on the offensive. But the idea settled into me like dry kindling, ready to catch. I spent the next few days doing what I do best, working quietly, listening deeply. I called in a favor to an old buddy who ran title searches down in the county seat. Told him to run her address, pull any liens, debts, or tax issues he could find. He got back to me faster than I expected. "House is tied up in a shared equity loan," he said. "That means if one party wants out, they gotta sell. And guess what? Husband filed for separation 6 weeks ago. Can they sell without her knowing who's buying?" I asked. "If the offer's clean and through the right channels, absolutely." It felt like the wind had shifted. That afternoon, I drove into town, put on my best shirt, and walked into the real estate office that handled most of the HOA's listings. I didn't use my name. Just handed over a business card for a holding company I kept for tax reasons. Said I was looking to expand into retirement rentals, and the neighborhood near Lakeview had caught my interest. They showed me a few homes, but when they pulled up hers, I leaned forward. "That one," I said. "I want it. Full cash offer. No contingencies. Close in 2 weeks." The agent blinked. "It's not officially listed yet." "Then they'll be happy someone's willing to take it fast." We drew up the paperwork that day. I signed it with a steady hand and walked out feeling something I hadn't felt since the morning I buried my father with his dog tags and pocket knife folded tight in his hand. I felt ready. It took 6 days. 6 quiet, patient days. I went about my chores, mended a busted rain gutter, hauled hay out to the back pasture, drank my coffee watching mist rise off the lake. Then the call came. "Offer accepted," the agent said. "Closing scheduled for next Friday." I thanked him and hung up, heart steady, breath calm. I stood on my porch and looked across the water toward her house, half hidden behind the trees. She called the cops on me for walking across my own land, tried to sell my lake, file my world under someone else's name. But now I owned hers. And I wasn't done. Not yet. The morning of the closing was quiet. No wind, no bird song, just that stillness that settles in when something's about to shift. I had black coffee in one hand and the deed to her future in the other. The porch boards creaked under my boots as I stepped down and walked to the truck. Dust puffed up from the driveway like it knew where I was headed. The title office sat on the edge of town, just past the old grain elevator and across from the diner that still served pie like it meant something. Inside, everything smelled like copier toner and lemon polish. The receptionist smiled, handed me a folder, and said the paperwork was ready. It didn't take long. A few signatures, a notary stamp, and it was done. I walked out with keys in my pocket and a bill of sale that made her house mine. I didn't go straight there. Not yet. I took the long road home, the one that curled through the back hills and past the first fence my father ever strung. It gave me time to think. About legacy. About the way people mistake politeness for weakness. She thought I was just an old rancher clinging to mud and memory. She didn't know I'd been taught to move slow, watch close, and strike only when the ground was solid beneath me. Later that day, I parked a quarter-mile from her property and walked the rest of the way in. No need to make a scene. The key fit clean. The door creaked like it was surprised to see me. The place was spotless, staged for showings even though no sign stood in the yard. I didn't touch anything, just walked through like a man counting tools in his new shed. It was modern and cold, all white granite and recessed lights. Pretty, but hollow. No history in the walls, no stories under the floorboards. I opened the back door and stepped into the yard. From there, I could see my lake through the trees, the water still and wide, just as it had been for generations. The same water she tried to turn into a selling point, the same view she used in her little brochures. Now it was mine again, without contest. I didn't tell anyone. Not Hank, not Carla at the clerk's office, not even the agent who'd handled the sale. I let it sit, let the knowledge settle like silt in a deep pond. In a few days, I'd have the surveyors out, then the fencing crew. But for now, it was enough to stand in her backyard, the air clean and sweet with spring, and know that she had no idea what had just happened. The next morning, I saw her watering her potted shrubs with a bright green hose, lips pursed like she was kissing the soil. She didn't see me. I stayed behind the tree line, watching in silence. The same woman who'd tried to evict my legacy one phone call at a time was humming to herself, completely unaware she was standing on land she no longer owned. And that was the beauty of it. She had pushed paper. I'd pushed back with ink and timing. Now the property line wasn't theoretical. It was legal, final, and mine. I took the long way back to the house, sun warming my shoulders, breeze just starting to rise. Some fights get loud. Others end with a knock on the door and a man with a clipboard. But the best ones? They end with keys in your pocket and your enemy fenced in without ever hearing the hammer fall. The survey crew showed up early, just after dawn, their truck rumbling down the road like thunder with wheels. 3 men in canvas work shirts and boots stepped out and got straight to it, slamming stakes into the soil and stretching bright orange cord across what used to be her backyard. I watched from my truck, with the window down, coffee steaming in the cup holder, country radio low in the background. She came outside about an hour later, robe tight across her chest, that same green hose forgotten at her feet. Her hair was still pinned up, sunglasses already on. She froze the moment she saw the men in boots and hats, marking lines across her neatly mowed grass. She marched toward them, arms stiff, words flying before she even reached them. I couldn't hear what she said at first, but I saw her finger point, saw the younger surveyor shake his head and hold up a clipboard like a shield. Then she saw me. I stepped out of the truck slow, hands in my pockets. The wind had picked up just a little, pulling at the edge of her robe. Her heels sunk slightly into the soft earth as she stormed over to me. "What is this?" she asked, voice already cracked with panic. I looked past her to the fresh line of flags. "Looks like a fence line," I said. "On my property?" "No," I said. "On mine." She laughed, but there was no real laughter in it. "You're insane. You can't just put a fence across my yard." I pulled the deed from my back pocket, unfolded it, and handed it to her. "You signed the sale papers. This house belongs to me, the yard, the tree line, the side gate, all of it. You're still living here because I haven't told you otherwise." She looked at the paper like it was poison. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Behind her, the survey crew hammered in another post. "I made a cash offer through a holding company," I said. "Your husband signed off last week. You didn't even check. Too busy filing false complaints, maybe." She shook her head, hands trembling. "This is a mistake. I have rights." "You did," I said. "Now you have 30 days to move." Her jaw clenched, and she turned on her heel, storming back toward the house without another word. The door slammed, hard enough to rattle the windows. By the next day, the fencing crew had arrived. Heavy wooden posts stacked in piles, steel wire rolled like coiled snakes. They worked fast, laughing and sweating in the sun, setting the line tight and tall, no gaps, no shortcuts. I gave them instructions to box in the property completely. No access to the lake, no gate facing the dock. The only way out would be through the front yard, down the gravel road and back to town. She watched from the upstairs window most of the day. Sometimes she'd come out and bark at the workers, threatening lawyers or fines. They didn't answer, just pointed to me, and I'd tip my hat. When the fence was done, it looked clean and sharp, sturdy enough to hold back cattle or coyotes, but it wasn't built for animals. It was built for memory. The kind that kept honest folks in and meddling ones out. That night, as the last light sank below the trees, I stood by the edge of the lake and looked back. Her house sat boxed in like a fancy toy inside a case. Quiet. Still. For the first time since this whole mess started, there was peace. She'd come here thinking rules and polish would buy her power, but she forgot the land doesn't care about clipboards or bylaws. The land remembers sweat. It remembers the boots that walked it before the pavement came, and it never forgets who truly belongs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to call the sheriff or throw a punch. I just drew the line. And when the dust settled, she found herself on the wrong side of it. Word got out fast, as it tends to in small towns and tight circles. By the weekend, you'd have thought I'd lit a fire in the middle of Lakeview's community picnic. The fence was all anyone talked about. Some folks didn't like it. Some secretly admired it, but every one of them showed up to that Sunday HOA meeting, crowding into the clubhouse like it was Judgment Day. I didn't get an invite, but I came anyway. Wore clean jeans, my oldest work shirt, and the boots that had seen every inch of my land. When I walked in, heads turned. Some folks cleared a path like they expected me to cause trouble. I just smiled and tipped my hat to the ones I recognized. The room was all polished wood and tension. Folding chairs packed tight, papers shuffled nervously in laps. Karen sat at the front, her jaw tight, a folder clutched in her hands. Next to her stood the HOA president, a retired dentist with a soft voice and a tendency to fold under pressure. He cleared his throat when he saw me, then gestured for everyone to settle. "We're here," he said, "to address recent concerns over boundary disputes and community harmony." I raised my hand before he could say more. "This ain't a dispute," I said. "It's ownership. That fence went up on my land. Land I purchased fair and legal. The woman beside you didn't bother to read the fine print when her name got dropped from the title." A ripple went through the crowd. Karen's face flushed, but she kept quiet. I pulled out the deed and laid it flat on the table. I didn't come to argue, I said, just to put this in front of anyone. Still confused about where the lines fall. I own the house. I own the yard. I own the path to the lake. Someone in the back muttered, "Wait, the whole lake?" "Every inch that touches my side," I said, "and more than half the water. My rights go back 2 generations. My family dug the first well out there and sank the first dock." Karen stood then, her voice sharp. "This man has been disruptive to our community. He has refused to cooperate with beautification efforts, resisted oversight, and built a fence meant to provoke." I turned to her, calm as morning. "The only thing I provoked was your sense of entitlement. You tried to take what wasn't yours. You filed fake complaints, had me cuffed in front of my own fence. And when that didn't work, you tried to annex me with a pen." The president cleared his throat again, louder this time. "We've reviewed the documents. The board has concluded that the sale of the property was legal and binding, and that any boundary concerns were created by a misunderstanding of jurisdiction." Karen stared at him like she didn't understand the words. "We also believe," he continued, "that moving forward, Mrs. Whitmore," he used her full name now, "should step down from her committee leadership position, effective immediately." It was quiet after that, real quiet. Even the air seemed to hold still. Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. She gathered her folder and left without a word. Her heels clacked hard against the tile. No one stopped her. I turned to leave, but just before I hit the door, the president spoke again. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, "thank you for your patience." I didn't answer, just nodded and stepped out into the sun, where the breeze carried the smell of cut grass and fresh dust. Sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge or raise a voice. Sometimes it just walks into a meeting, lays down the truth, and lets silence do the rest. The for sale sign went up 2 days later, white with red lettering, planted crooked in the soft earth near the edge of her driveway. I didn't smile when I saw it. I just nodded once and kept walking, my boots leaving clean tracks in the gravel. Her windows stayed dark after that. No more porch lights at night. No more trimmed hedges or clipped warnings taped to mailboxes. I never saw the moving truck. Either she left quiet, or she paid someone else to pack it up while she hid somewhere else. What mattered was that the house emptied. The SUV disappeared. The curtains stayed drawn, and for the first time since this all began, I could walk the length of my property without feeling someone's eyes pressing against my back. I spent that Sunday morning by the lake, just like I used to when I was a boy. The sky was pale blue, still cool from the night, and the water was flat as a pane of glass. I brought an old folding chair and a thermos of black coffee, sat at the end of the dock where the boards creaked and dipped under my weight. The same dock they tried to call shared shoreline. Funny how folks can twist the truth until it serves their ambition. There were no birds that day, only the soft lap of water against the posts and the wind brushing through the reeds. I sipped my coffee and watched the trees sway. A part of me expected something to interrupt the moment, some new complaint, some last gasp of paperwork or pride, but nothing came. Just quiet. I thought about my father then, how he used to sit on this dock with a cane pole in hand, straw hat tilted low over his eyes, letting the world turn while he barely moved. He always said the trick to keeping land wasn't in holding it tight, it was in letting it know you were listening, that if you paid attention, the land would whisper when something was wrong, and if you took care of it, it would take care of you. I looked over toward the far bank, where the fence now stood tall and straight, clean lines, clear boundaries, no more confusion. No more pretend authority from folks who didn't know the first thing about dirt or time. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out something I'd been saving. Her old HOA sign, one of the small metal ones she liked to plant around the neighborhood, with the Lakeview Haven logo stamped in plastic gold. I'd found it in a pile near the edge of her yard before the sale closed, tossed out like it never mattered. I'd kept it quiet, waiting for the right moment. I took a nail and a hammer from my tool bag and walked to the side of my barn. The nail went in clean, wood splitting just enough to hold. I hung the sign crooked, tilted slightly, and drove a second nail straight through the middle. Then I stepped back. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint sound of chain links clinking together at the far fence gate. I smiled, just a little, then walked back to the dock. There are victories that come with cheering, with crowds, with speeches and handshakes. And then there are the quiet ones, where the sun rises over a lake you saved, and the only sound is the soft creak of old boards under your boots. That was enough for me. The seasons turned slower out here. You didn't see it so much in the leaves or the weather, not right away. You saw it in the way the wind shifted through the grass, in how the shadows stretched a little longer every morning, in the way the frogs took longer to come back after winter. Out in the city, everything rushed forward like it was racing to nowhere. But here, time walked, careful and quiet, like a man watching for snakes. It had been 4 weeks since the house across the way emptied out. The sign came down 2 days after a couple in a black SUV moved in. I didn't meet them. They didn't introduce themselves, and I figured that was best. They kept to themselves, no clipboards, no letters, no sudden declarations about community standards. The woman waved once from her porch while watering a row of rosemary planters, and I nodded from my fence line. That was enough. There were no more survey flags showing up in the grass. No more patrol cars creeping by slow pretending they weren't looking for trouble. No more calls from Hank with warnings about new filings. Just stillness. The lake stayed low that spring. The rain came late, but I didn't mind. The old cypress trees stood with their roots dry but patient, like they'd seen it all before. The dock held firm. The boards had warped some over the years, but they still carried my weight when I stepped out with my coffee each morning. One Saturday I brought out the folding chair and set it on the dock like I had so many times before. I didn't bring any tools, no papers, no tape measures, no maps. Just the chair, the thermos, and a book I never planned to read. The breeze rolled in across the water, soft and warm, and the sun rose clean above the tree line. The frogs had come back in full by then, their voices carrying over the water like laughter. I sat for a long time, watching, not thinking much, just breathing. This land had been in my family longer than anything I owned, longer than the house, longer than the fence, longer than the scars on my hands. My father had raised cattle here with more faith than money, and his father before him had worked the same soil without so much as a tractor to his name. Their stories weren't written down. They were tucked into the corners of barns and wrapped in the calluses of old tools. When I buried my father, I didn't give him a headstone. I gave him the lake. Scattered his ashes on a still morning just like this one. Watched the ripples carry him out into the same waters where he once taught me to swim. I never said much that day. Just stood with my hand on the dock post and whispered a promise that I'd keep it whole. That I wouldn't let it be paved over or renamed or carved into pieces by strangers who'd never cut a fence wire or repaired a busted pump. They came close. Closer than I'd expected, with printed maps and legal filings and a confidence that only came from never losing something worth keeping. But they didn't know the land. They didn't know how to read the wind or what it meant when the deer stopped coming down to the banks. They saw property lines. I saw memory. I stood and walked the length of the dock. The boards groaned under my boots, but they held, just like always. I reached the end, where the water lapped quiet and cold against the edge. Reached into my jacket and pulled out the old photograph I kept folded in my wallet. My father and I, both of us younger than I remembered, standing knee-deep in mud with a string of fish and grins that didn't need a reason. I looked at that picture for a long while. Then I folded it up and slipped it back where it belonged. Behind me, the house sat just as it should, paint weathered, shutters faded, fence lines strong. There was a new sign nailed to the barn wall, rusted just enough to match the wood. The old HOA plaque Karen had left behind, with a bullet hole clean through the middle. It stayed crooked on the nail, tilted just enough to make its point. I poured the last of my coffee into the water and watched the ripples stretch outward like rings from a church bell. She tried to take the lake, tried to sell it, claim it, fence it under a name that didn't belong to her. But she forgot something simple, something that can't be measured on a surveyor's map or printed in a glossy brochure. It was never just a lake. It was home. And it's still mine.